Well, good evening and thank you for joining me. You honor me with your presence. Right now, our viewership has gone up considerably, and I want to thank you for doing that. If you would like to support this ministry and have more people watch these videos, please press the like button, because when you do that, the thumbs up sign, when you do that, it tells YouTube that other people are interested, and more than half of my new viewers come from YouTube recommendations. So I'd appreciate that. If you want to know when every one of these new videos comes out, you can subscribe to my channel. In any case, thank you for that, and I hope this continues to bless. Tonight we're talking about Moses' history lesson. The present truth in Deuteronomy is about Moses' history lesson. We talked last week about the steps of exegesis and biblical theology and systematic theology. And the author of these lessons is doing a very good job. And tonight, Moses, he's going to expose how Moses talks about the three existential questions that are most important to all of us. Who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going? In this case, in a very immediate sense for them, because there's the long-term sense and there's the short-term sense. As someone said, though, the best long-term plan tells you, what do I do next? Right away, and that's true. It's also important to understand that sometimes we change our understanding of where we're going, and that's okay. Another person said we steer by the stars, not because we hope to reach them, but because they show us which way to go. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight, is seeing how Moses is trying to help prepare the people of God, the children of Israel, for entry into the promised land. There are the three existential questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? Stay tuned and you will see the answers to these questions and even more information about what we're doing here. Let's begin, as we try to always do, with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to serve and to share. We thank you that you have chosen to communicate, to cooperate with human instruments and human help in spreading your word. And we ask that we will be effective as we do that it will be your voice that is heard, that it is your spirit that leads these studies. We ask all this in Jesus' name and for his sake. This is really something. Now, this is a quotation from 1 Corinthians. And again, the author's going somewhat far afield sometimes, the author of the lessons on Deuteronomy, but he is trying to put them in the context. Deuteronomy has, again, it had timely application at that time. But then if we're going to go through the entire process of interpretation, we need to know what is its timeless application, so that we can apply that principle to the times we're living in, so that we can have knowledge from God, guidance from God about which way to go today. And they all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them. And that rock was Christ. Well, of course, he's not talking literally. Your rocks don't follow people, and you don't drink from rocks. But he's talking about Israel, the history of Israel. Remember that water came forth from the rock in the middle of the desert. Of course, water is life-giving, and the rock is also the foundation stone. Jesus talked about building your house upon the sand or your house upon the rock. And so this is the way in which the author of the First Corinthians is speaking, that Christ was the foundation of their faith. He was the foundation of their identity as the children of Israel, but he was also the life-giving spirit, that spiritual drink, that water. And we're in the same position, that is, that Christ is the rock of our salvation, the founding principle, that upon which our foundation is based. And he's also that which gives life in the driest of places. A sinful world, we need true life, and that's only available through Jesus Christ. As he said to the woman at the well, I'll give you water to drink, and it'll be like springs of water. So That's what's being talked about here in a figurative sense. But they needed to understand in Deuteronomy that this is what was happening, that they were having concrete experiences, no, pardon the pun. They were having, these real experiences, but that they were in fact the fruit and the expression of faith. Or alternatively, they were the fruit and expression of doubt, which is the opposite of faith. So we want to look at that in detail, and we're going to study that with you. Again, these three existential questions, just to remind you what they are. Who am I? Why am I here? And where am I going? And the answers to these I call identity. That's who am I? Where do I fit? And identity is only understood in the context of why am I here, which is where I've come from, and where am I going, which is we'll see here. Where am I going? Those three things, have an interplay, because each of us is on this line between the foundation of the earth and the end of all things, and we have an identity which is based upon our understanding of where we are in this and our role that God has designed for us in this place. Why am I here? Well, that's history. It isn't why in the sense of telling us why we're here, but how we got here. That's what it's more on the why am I here than the why am I here. My identity depends upon these other things, history. How did I get to be in this place at this time? And that's extremely important for the people who received the book of Deuteronomy, because they were at a particular point in history when they were about to enter the promised land, and they needed to be prepared for. It was a total change from one, slavery, which they'd been through for centuries, and two, wandering the wilderness, which they'd been through for decades. And now they were going to have to change and have a totally different way of life. There would be a conquest, which took about 7 or 8 years, and then they would have to settle into real life. So that was, it's important to know who I am and how am I going to fit in to this great plan. And then there's destiny. Where am I going? Now, it's wonderful for me. I love being a Seventh-day Adventist because our identity, why am I here, is founded in creation, the seventh day. And where am I going is toward the new world, the new earth, the Advent. Seventh-day Adventists have a built-in sense of history and destiny, but we don't always have a good sense of identity, as George Knight has talked about. That's something we need to work on, but that's a great privilege. So here we are. These are the three questions, and Moses is going to answer them. But again, sometimes it's going to be in broad terms, and sometimes it will be in narrow, specific terms, and that's okay, because sometimes we need the big picture. We said the greatest long-term plan tells us what do we do next? Where's the next step? But at the same time, we need to know that next step. We need to focus in on that. All right, here's our long-term destiny. How do I get there starting now, where I am? And so we begin with this picture this way. Then Moses said, "You have been set apart to the Lord today, for you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day." That's what he says to Israel. And this is after a disastrous situation that they had to stand up to. The next day, Moses said to the people, "You committed a great sin." This is after the golden calf. But now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So this is, who are you now? Well, the answer is, this is the answer to who am I at that moment. They are people who have been set apart. And the ones who he's talking to have survived the purge that took place after the golden calf. And then the next thing he tells them is, you committed a terrible sin. Well, this is true of all of us. We have been set apart. We've been chosen by God, but we also committed great sins. How does this work, and how does God save us? Well, of course, that's what the Bible is all about. God's saving actions on behalf of his people. But here's where they were at this moment, and here's where we are at our moment. We are all this way. God has set us apart. He's set you apart. You have a role to play that no one else can play. At the same time, you're not perfect. You're not the savior of the world. That's already taken. I'm not perfect. I have sins. Some of these are terrible sins that I really should know better than to do. That isn't the problem. The problem is whether I trust in God or not. So, who am I? This is the truth of where we live, being set apart, chosen, and also flawed. That's just how we live. Then Moses did this. This is what he said to Israel we had before. You know, you've been set apart and also you've sinned greatly. Then Moses goes, he said, I'll go back and see if I can atone for you. I'll see if I can get forgiveness granted for you. I'll see if this can be resolved. We can be reconciled to God. When then Moses went back, the Lord said, oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold, but now please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written. This is an astonishing thing. Because Moses, you know, God spoke to Moses as a man speaks to his friend face to face. There was an intimate relationship between Moses and God. And so Moses understood that the book that God had written was, we would call it now, looking backward. This is a systematic theology statement because it would not have been understood that way to Moses. The book of the Lamb, the book of life of the Lamb. It's mentioned in Revelation. This is God's book of life. And he says, if you're not going to save them, then don't save me either. Now, you can argue about whether that's a good idea or not, but basically, this is where Moses is foreshadowing the sacrifice of Christ. Because Christ died the second death on the cross for us so that we would not have to. He allowed himself to face separation from the Father, which is what the second death is, total separation from the Father, so that we would not have to. And so Moses here is acting in a Christ-like way. If you know, he's coming and saying, forgive them, but you know, I'm coming in, and if you're not going to forgive them, don't forgive me either. And that's really an amazing thing. But it shows to God, not that God didn't know, but it also demonstrates to us through the written word that Moses is precisely the kind of person. And by the way, Moses will commit some grievous sins before it's done, and he will not be allowed to enter the land of promise, although, as we find out later, he will be resurrected and taken to heaven. But Moses has committed grievous sins. He, like us, was selected, was set apart, was chosen for a particular role. But he was also flawed. But the flaws don't matter so much as his faith in God. And he has faith that God will forgive the people and therefore will forgive him. But he's going to go all the way to help save God's people. And this demonstrates both to God and to Moses where his heart is. I'm not sure that he can say the same about me. I like to think that my heart breaks for the people that God's heart breaks for. I like to think that I would be this way. But this is a very stark thing to do. You know, blot me out. Wow. Amazing thing for him to say. Now, these are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel in the wilderness east of the Jordan. This is sort of a preamble to what's taking place in Deuteronomy. There are several sermons, we believe, preached by Moses, and the whole purpose is to prepare the people of God, the children of Israel, to enter into the land of promise. They had been set apart. They were flawed. And it's important that he takes this whole thing up. And it's in a matter of fulfilled prophecy. So to all East Israel and the wilderness east of Jordan, because they went around the sea, the Dead Sea, and they came back across, because between the Jordan and the Mediterranean is where God had promised Israel would be that he promised Abraham that he would inherit. This is the promised land for the Israelites. These are the words that Moses spoke in the wilderness, east of Jordan, that is, in the Arabah. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that the Lord had commanded him concerning them. So God had commanded Moses concerning these people. East of the Jordan, it says again, in the territory of Moab. So the people for whom this is written, who lived somewhat later, knew exactly where it was. Moses began to expound this law, Deuteronomy, saying, the Lord God said to us at Horeb, you stayed long enough at this mountain. Now they spent a year, more or less, at Sinai or at Horeb, two names for the same place. They spent a year as they received the law and as they built the sanctuary, physically constructed it. And then it was time for them to move to the promised land. But as we recognize, they didn't do what they were supposed to do. Now, it was 40 years to the day that he did this. And that's important to understand. According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, God had said in Numbers, when they came back and they said, no, we're not going to go. God had commanded them to go, but they said, no, they're too ferocious for us. We're not doing it. That is 10 of the 12 spies, all except Caleb and Joshua. And God says, okay, have it your way. According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days. For each day, you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. This is Numbers 14:34. So he tells them, you spent 40 days deciding? Well, now you get 40 years to think about it. A year for each day. And I want to, why am I here? Why are you here? Why are they here on this day? And Moses is giving them this law on this day, and the answer is here. You've had your 40 years now. It was in the 40th year, he said. He said, it's been 40 years, and he wants them to remember how you got here because you did not follow what the Lord wanted you to do. Now, they were there because they were the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all that other. They knew that, and that was also going to be mentioned. But right now, they're here, and they're entering today and not 40 years ago because of what happened 40 years ago. And they need to remember what happened so that they do not commit the same error. This is the old thing that those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And I always say they repeat mistakes. Somehow people never learn from the things that went right. But we tend to repeat history's mistakes over and over again. And that's why history, the more recent history, is being brought up. It's very fashionable today to say, move on, don't talk about the past. But the past is how we got where we are. And that's what is happening here in Deuteronomy, is that Moses is saying, here's why you are entering today. Don't forget it. Because, they're going to go into Canaan, and the land of Canaan, they're going to conquer many people. At least they're going to have to fight them. They're not just going to blow away. And they have to remember as they go through this process to follow what God says. Because 40 years ago, God had said, go and take the land. They said, no, we can't do it. And then God said, well, because you didn't do it. And they said, well, no, we'll do it. And they went up and they were decimated. They lost many, many lives. Because God told them, you go up now, I'm not with you. You had a chance when, I gave you the opportunity to go, and I would go with you. And now if you go, you're going on your own, and you will not prosper. So they need to understand this, and we will soon see in the historical narrative. We won't. It's not part of these lessons, but in the historical narrative, they're going to take up Jericho, and they're going to march around it and blow trumpets, and that's going to bring the city down without really, as we would say, firing a shot. In their case, maybe firing an arrow. But then, because they keep some of the goods of Jericho for themselves, which they were commanded not to do, they have a terrible defeat in their next battle. So this is actionable intelligence. This is what God wants them to know now. You're here now 40 years later because you didn't listen to me 40 years ago. So going forward, as you conquer this land, I will be with you, but you must listen to me. You must allow me to help you. So that's a part of what's going on here. You've been 40 years because of that. Now I take an excursus, which just means a side trip or a detour. And that is sometimes we end up with very long discussions about, well, how do we know it's a day for a year? How can we prove? Is there a specific text that says that this prophecy is a day for a year? And the answer to that is really quite simple. This is simply the way they thought. And so in prophetic terms, if you have days and years back and forth, it's very likely that the prophecy is in days, it means years, just as they spent 40 days. In Daniel's praying about deliverance because he understands that it's about the Sabbaths of the land, that they did not observe the Sabbaths of the land, and that's why God put them in exile. Well, the Sabbaths of the land were a year for a day. That is to say, the ordinary week, every seventh day was the Sabbath. But the Sabbaths of the land, every seventh year was a Sabbath for the land. So we need to understand this, that this is just simply the way they thought. This is a very ancient mindset, and you didn't need to explain it. Like there's so many things we do today we don't need to explain, because everyone does understand it in the context of what's happening here. Don't count your chickens before they're hatched. Doesn't really have much to do with keeping poultry. We all know that. Okay? And we're just saying, don't spend your profits. Don't count on things you don't know about yet. And that's part of the problem. So in the 40-year, the day for a year and the year for a day, this flip-flop back and forth was just simply a mindset. They did it all the time. It was the way they thought. And of course, we have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we have the temptation in the wilderness where Jesus went in for 40 days. And in case you wonder whether these 40 days in the wilderness represent the 40 days of wandering or 40 years of wandering, every text that Jesus answers with is from, guess what? Deuteronomy, where the subject is the history of 40 years of wandering and why they are there why they're in the wilderness now and how they're going to leave it. So Jesus clearly understood. And even without the 40 years and the 40 days and so forth, he signals it by using the text, the text in Deuteronomy as his answering. Too often we say, well, he answered the word, and so we should find something from the word. He didn't just find something from the word. Again, looking back at our three-step process that we had about exegesis and biblical theology and systematic theology, he was doing that work. And he understands he's driven by the Spirit into the wilderness. He's spending 40 days there. And that this is to remind him of the experience of Israel. And in the Gospel of Matthew, it's also to demonstrate that he is Israel. He is the embodiment of all God wanted Israel to be. That's a separate topic, but we'll move on today. Going back to the time of Deuteronomy. Now, God had promised Abram that the children of Israel would be, his descendants would become like the sands of the sea, like the stars in the sky. He doesn't mean literally, it's a figure of speech. It just means that more than you can count. Okay? So at that time I said to you, you are too heavy a burden for me to carry. This is Moses talking to the children of Israel. You are too heavy a burden for me to carry alone. You see, this was almost the royal or the kingly model, where the king was the ultimate arbiter of justice in the kingdom. And every petty household quarrel was brought before the king, not just the intransigent ones like the two women claiming this baby and so forth, but just every day, you know. We saw this in the New Testament where two brothers came to Jesus and said, you know, help us divide it and make him share it with me. It's like, you know, that's not what I'm here for. And that's not what Moses could do. He could not lead the people. He could not be in daily communion with God and therefore refreshing his spirit and assuring that he would be leading properly. He could not do that and solve every household spat that arose. And so he needed to take on only the few things that mattered the most. And that's when he put the people in captain there in groups of 50s and 100s and so forth. And he had people to handle all those levels. So now we're talking about several 100,000 households. So there would be a lot of people involved. But that's the whole point. And if I had time to go into leadership, I have experience in this. And I can tell you one of the things about leadership is that leaders shouldn't be doing everything. The famous saying of Lao Tse, the Chinese philosopher, was that when the best leaders are finished, the people say we did it ourselves, because of course they did. What they don't realize is that the leadership was what allowed them. I think of leadership as a catalyst. It's not a reagent. That is to say, in a chemical experiment, catalyst is present and it allows a reaction to take place, but it is not itself part of the reaction. It is not oxidized. It is not reduced. Nothing that's going on in the reaction directly implies to platinum, for example, the catalyst. But the platinum makes certain kinds of reactions possible. That's what the enzymes in our body function in that way. They allow certain chemical processes to take place within our bodies that if it weren't for the enzymes, if it had to be done as it's done in a laboratory, it would kill us. The conditions are far too extreme. But enzymes act as a catalyst, and so it makes it possible for these things to take place. So that's good leadership. Good leadership is totally involved, but not totally in control, because there is no such thing. And because if you were, then everybody would simply be an extension of you. It would be like a bunch of robots, and you can't get the creativity and the ideas and the imagination and the enthusiasm from other people if you're in charge. So one of the simplest things that I will say about leadership is the more power you want to exercise, the more you must give it away, the less you must exercise. You only exercise power. You only take a stand when the mission itself is threatened. And that's when you have to do that. Otherwise, you try to let other people shine. So, but here's Moses saying, I'm just overwhelmed. So here's Moses saying, I'm just overwhelmed. I cannot handle all of these petty crimes and so forth. And that was correct. He couldn't do it. But he at the same time, he says, this is good news and bad news, if you will. You're too heavy a burden for me to carry. But the Lord God has increased your numbers so that today you are as numerous as the stars in the sky. He is nothing less than proclaiming that at least a partial fulfillment of the promise to Abraham has taken place, and they are themselves the evidence of it, which can be very motivating when you think about it. May the Lord God of your ancestors increase you 1,000 times and bless you as he has promised. So there may be all of these prophets, all of these advantages that have taken place, and they may have multiplied many times, but he's saying, let's multiply many times more. So That's why he's not complaining. He's saying, I cannot do it anymore. You need someone else, someone in addition to. With something like 2 million people, Moses is simply overwhelmed. He can't possibly deal with all of the household spats and the neighborhood problems. And so this is when his father-in-law Jethro steps in, and they subdivide the responsibility. So that's what this is about. But when he uses these words, your numbers are God has increased your numbers so today that you are as numerous as the stars in the sky. This is specific language. And what it's specific to is to the threefold promise that he gave to Abraham, that God gave to Abraham. And here is that threefold promise. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. All the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. To your offspring will I give this land. And when he said a great nation, he says you'll be as numerous as the stars in the sky, as numerous on the sands on the beach. And of course, these are not literal terms. And nobody's saying he's got billions and billions of descendants by the time of Moses. But they are figures of speech. And they mean the same thing today they would have meant then, which is they're too many to number. You can't count them. Now technically, I suppose we could. We count large numbers these days, but that's the point. Is that just in their scheme of things, they were not going to be able to count it. There were too many. There were more than they could handle, and that's what was happening. So when Moses says that you are as numerous as the stars, he is saying God has blessed you. He has brought you to this place. This is part of their identity. But he has blessed you, but now you're too many for one man to handle. And that's, just makes sense. But let's look at that threefold promise, because this is the basis of the covenant with Abraham, the basis upon which the Jews were the people of the promise. And this threefold covenant, now I'm going to tell you right now that I'm going to have some time periods here, but they're very approximate, and they're based upon my guesses and my the way I estimate things. You may differ, your time frame may differ. That's not the important part. The important part really is to look at and see this relative to the time of Abraham himself, to his own life. Because Abraham, this promise is made to Abraham. Let's see how long it takes to fulfill it. And again, we can quibble about the absolute numbers, but I have it roughly 800 plus years from the time of Abraham until the time of David and Solomon, because they weren't really a nation state until that time. Now you can argue that they were as numerous as the stars in the sky in Moses' day, which would have been a good 400 years earlier than that, roughly. Remember, there's this rule of thumb. It's 400 years for the slavery, 400 years for the judges, 400 years for the monarchy, and 400 years between the exile to Jesus. So all of those time periods. So that's what this is based on. But they're very approximate, and ancient dates are extremely and notoriously difficult to set with absolute precision. We just don't have the ability to do that right now. But it doesn't matter, because it was long after the promise was made to Abraham. Whatever time it was, whether it was 500 years or 800 years, it was long after Abraham was gone. So the promise was made to Abraham, but it was not fulfilled in his lifetime. And in fact, you'll see that none of them were. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. Now I put this at the cross, which would have been 2,000 at least years from the time of Abraham until the time of Christ. So there you are. And this is the statement of Simeon in the temple when Jesus was brought in on the 8th day. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of your people, Israel. So that's the marvelous thing here. All the peoples on the earth will be blessed by you. The Gentiles are all blessed because the revelation of who you are, who God is, and what he wants to do, and how he loves us, All that is being made through the person Jesus Christ. But because he comes through the line of Abraham and the Jews, it is to the glory of the people of Israel. And that's appropriate. That's Simeon again in the temple when Jesus was 8 days old. And Simeon says, now I can die in peace because I've seen your salvation. All right. That's 2,000 years, much longer. And then to your offspring, I will give this land. Now, when Abraham, when his wife Sarah died, he didn't own any land in the land of promise. It was still promise. It was still in the future. And he had to pay what turns out to have been an exorbitant price for a small piece of property, the cave of Machpelah. He didn't have any place he could even bury his beloved wife. And so he had to pay an exorbitant price for a very tiny piece of land. And that's all he owned. To your offspring, he says, I will give this. God said, I will give this land. Well, it would be to the offspring. And they really didn't own much land for a long time. Joseph, on his deathbed, says, please, when God comes and calls you out of here, take my bones with you and bury me with my fathers in the cave of Machpelah. So you have that whole thing. That's all the land they own. And so before they actually inherited the land, which they're about to do in the book of Deuteronomy, remember that timeline we had last week? That is to say, they're preparing for the conquest of the land. That's the whole point. They've spent 40 years wandering. All this generation knows is nomadic existence. And they're going to have to now go in and conquer, and they're going to live a settled lifestyle. And that's why they need the covenant renewed and applied to their new situation. It was one thing when they were wandering the desert. It's going to be a totally different thing. Well, not totally different, but very different in many aspects and details when they are settled down. Now, they're not going to be gathering manna anymore. And so there are other such differences that must be accounted for. The principles of the Ten Commandments have not changed, but the application of them to their lifestyle will have to change. And that is exactly what Deuteronomy is all about. It's reminding them of where they've been, how they've been living, and of the covenant that was made. And now it is the book of the covenant. And now taking that covenant and because the law, the Ten Commandments, is part of the covenant at Sinai, taking that covenant and applying it to the new conditions in which they will find themselves. And this is important for all of us. We have to do this all the time. We talked about this last week, that you have exegesis. You find out what was said. Then you have biblical theology. What did they believe? How did they understand what it was? And then systematic theology is, how do we apply it today? We have to know how they understood it, the principle. They applied it in certain ways, but we must apply it to our circumstances. And our circumstances are radically different. You can say what you can about, no one, the stranger within your gates, no one within your gates should violate the Sabbath. What if you live in a condo in a secular city? You have people within your gates or within your gated community, and you have no control over them, nor should you try to have. So it has to be applied in a new way. Most of us, or many of us, have to drive to church through roads that are filled with billboards and other kinds of secular enticements, shall we say. And these are just new challenges to understanding what it means to keep the Sabbath, for example. So that's what's taking place here. And understand that this threefold promise was fulfilled and is being fulfilled, because there will be more. Typical prophecy has a prediction, a fulfillment, and a consummation. And for most, or for many prophecies, the consummation is, of course, at the end of time when we enter the new earth. We won't look at that tonight, but do you see that it took a long time? Abraham the promise came, but it was not fulfilled until Abraham was long gone. And we need to understand that and have some patience. We all want to see things done now. We all want to see, that we don't have to wait any time. We're impatient. I certainly am. But um, we need to realize that God's purposes, they know no haste or no delay, and it will be fulfilled. If he says it, it will be fulfilled. It may not be fulfilled at the time we expect. It may not be fulfilled in the way that we expect. Certainly the Messiah came, but he was not what they expected. And so we have to understand that and be ready and be humbled enough to say that we're not God, and so we don't know. We can accept what he does and not have to try and dictate to him what he must do, which is easy for us to fall into. The final part of this lesson is in some ways the most difficult because he talks about the iniquity of the Amorites, because the Amorites are going to be essentially exterminated. And we have a modern word for that, genocide. And we don't like this. And there are people who simply reject this and say, well, God didn't say these things. But it's very difficult to take these out of the scriptures and not, we end up like Thomas Jefferson with, cutting out a whole bunch. We have our own Bible. It's what I call the buffet style. You take what you want, you leave what you don't want. That's not up to us. The scriptures have come to us. Now we have to understand what they mean, and there are clearly some indications. For example, in Psalm 37, where it says, "Blessed is the one who bashes out the brains of the Babylonian babies on the streets." Clearly, this is not a divine desire. This is a human cry out. But that's what happens in the Psalms anyway. The Psalms are full of human outcry. That is not necessarily God's will, but it is human emotions, human reality. But in any case, we have to understand that some of these things, like these are directions that Moses is giving the children of Israel, and he's telling them that it comes from God. And so we're going to be difficult to just simply eliminate them. And the practices of the Amorites were, in fact, terrible. And I won't go into all the details, but they were frightful. They were horrific. And so we can look at it that way. But the reason I brought up this passage from Genesis 6, although it is not about the Amorites, one thing that people say, and it's mentioned in the lesson, is how God couldn't possibly ask for the destruction of every woman and every child. Well, not only could God do that, could he ask for it? He did it in the flood. Unless you think the flood was totally, didn't happen at all, and none of those people were killed. There were probably a lot more children, a lot more women killed in the flood than were killed certainly more than they were killed by the Israelites, because they never carried most of this out anyway. And contrary to what some people say, it's not just like other texts, because it's limited to a certain number of people in a certain period of time. It's not anyone who's not a Jew. It's not that anyone who's not one of the people of God should always be executed. There's nothing even remotely approaching that in scriptures. But here is what is explained as why, as the conditions, let's put it that way, that brought on the flood, which, if the story is at all accurate, again, killed many, many, many children and women, as well as men. And some of them might have not seemed, by our standards, to be particularly guilty, although the pre-flood, the evidence we have is pretty devastating as well, the Song of Lamech in Genesis 4. But I won't go through that again. But here's Genesis 6:5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Now that's difficult to imagine. That's difficult for us to even think about, because we find almost in some of the most difficult and worst people, there are moments, at least of some humanity, as someone said, Adolf Hitler loved his dog. But we also know, and I mentioned the story because it's horrific. But it's true. We know Hitler's last secretary, Charlie Unge, survived until around 2002, and she told this story in the late 90s that just before the end of World War II, before a day or two before Hitler and his the newly married wife, Eva Braun, committed suicide, the Goebbels family gave their children drugged milk at bedtime, warm milk to help them go to sleep, but there was also drug to keep them asleep. And then, while they were asleep, the physician who was down there went and gave each of them a fatal injection. And we know the reason because they had written a letter several days earlier saying that their children were too good to survive, to be forced to live in a world where Adolf Hitler was not the ruler. Now, we can't imagine this. This is horrific. They had 6 children, I believe, and they intentionally killed them simply because Hitler was no longer going to rule. And Hitler was obviously, the rule of the Nazis in Germany was horrific. So I don't know what to say about this. I don't say that I know that I'm not comfortable with the genocide or the extermination of the Amorite people. But I'm also at a loss to understand how people could become so inured to evil that they would kill their own children. And over someone like Adolf Hitler. But we've seen this. We've seen it at Jonestown. We've seen it at a number of places. And it may be, I'm not saying that it is, but it may be that some cultures just simply become so corrupt that even the children can't be salvaged. And I say this reluctantly, but I've learned a great deal from especially my daughters who study this about epigenetics, which is, to me, is bizarre. But in fact, that the DNA, that which makes up our persons and the instructions which constructed our bodies, continue to dictates the color of eyes and all sorts of things, can be rewritten by actions of other people close to you after you're born. It's strange. I always thought the DNA was fixed when you're born, but we have evidence now it's not. The DNA can be overwritten or rewritten. And it's possible, at least, with what we already know, that some of these cultures were so cruel and so evil, continuously, as it says here, every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Perhaps it's possible that some people some cultures even, become irredeemable. Now, we are not today called upon to do any of that. That doesn't. We're back to the difference between biblical theology and systematic theology. What they understood about their time, what they were told about that time, does not necessarily, in fact, we don't have the same circumstances. So it would not apply to us in that way at all. We need to be certain about that. So to say that it was required at that time is something we don't like, but we can't just throw it away. We may have to be humble and say, well, we'll have to ask God in the new earth. That happens. But that's the good part. There is a God. And I'm not it. You should be grateful for that. And you're not it either. Well, I hope these have been very helpful to you. And I've got for you this time 5 opportunities. If you would like to support this ministry, and recently our viewership has gone up remarkably. If you think this has benefited you and you would like it to benefit others, then here are 5 ways you can support us. The first one is you can pray for us. No matter what you have, it doesn't cost you a thing. You can have a little bit of time. You can pray for this ministry and ask God to bless us and to help us and to reach more people. You can click on like. The more people press the like on this, the more often this will be recommended to other people. Perhaps that's how you have joined us this time. If you click like, it will really help us because well more than half of the new viewers that we get are through recommendations by YouTube. Number 3, if you really are enjoying this, you can subscribe. That is, there's a subscribe button. Subscribe simply means that when a new video goes up that's available to the public, you will be notified. Number 4, you can comment. Help us to become better. I'm going to soon have some polls that'll be available in these videos where you can give me advice and tell me what kind of content you want better and how to mold this program into a way that's better for you. If you're really enthusiastic and would like to be a continuing supporter, you can become a patron at patreon.com. And finally, if you want to say something, you want to get access to me personally, you can send me an email at biblejourneys@yahoo.com. So these are all ways you can support us. If you'd like to do that, we would certainly be grateful for your help. Well, thank you, and the Lord bless you until we can meet again and embark on another Bible journey together.